So I want to have a little discussion about testing. Testing is like one of these things that I don't know. When I hear other people talk about it and like how people don't like unit testing, they think unit testing is dumb. It just kind of irks me because it's like my experience with unit testing has been actually pretty good. Like I'm able to actually get work done when new business requirements come in. It's very easy for me to go to a test, add a new test to make sure that I'm going to implement some logic that makes it pass, right? I try to follow TDD whenever I can. Sometimes it's easier said than done, but for the most part, like, TDD allows you to focus on what's important for the business and then just write the implementation and then move on with your day. And especially with unit testing, like your feedback loop is such, it's a faster feedback loop with the unit tests. And that's one thing that I'm kind of frustrated with the React is like everyone seems to use React testing library and they say that, oh, you don't need to use unit testing. Just use integration testing for your components and your UIs. And I think there's just something lacking. So I wanted to kind of talk about testing and like the different layers of testing. And hopefully you guys can learn something new about this. So there's three main types of testing. There's actually a lot of different types of testing, right? But the main ones are unit testing, integration testing, and end-to-end testing. So the backend and the front end. So I'll just put like backend here and I'll put front end here. And this font is super small. I don't know why that's so small. I will say that all this Accelodraw stuff, I've gotten this inspiration from Theo. Like this guy's really good at explaining everything. So when I use Accelodraw now, my inspiration came directly from Theo's channel. So thank you, Theo, for showing me this tool. But when you have an application, right, you have a front end and then you also have a back end. And when it comes to testing, there's different forms of testing you can do over both of these things, these layers, right? So inside the backend itself, you typically have layered architecture, right? You might have like controllers, and inside of those or outside of those controllers, you might have some type of like interactors or use cases. And then those use cases use something called repositories or I don't know, some persistence layer, some methods that basically interact with a database. So I'll just put domain here. Like this is like your domain, your business logic. And then typically you have persistence, and then you have like your API layer. Sometimes you can call this like gateways, or I don't know, let's just call it express, right? This is like the thing or next, the thing that's calling your business logic. So when you're writing out code, like often you want to make sure that you're unit testing this layer, right? So as you implement new features and new business requirements come in, it's not really that important. I mean, like to test the API layer, typically this layer is pretty dumb. All it does is it takes in a request from the UI and then it calls your domain logic. And this is where like all the meat and potatoes happens for your application. So you want to make sure you unit test this. And that thing will usually call something like a persistence layer, which again can be pretty dumb. Like usually it's just like do this query against my database and give me some data back. So when it comes to testing, I typically tend to just do a lot of unit testing over the domain, right? So unit test this a lot. And if you know what the word unit test is, like basically when you have a function, you just want to test that function in isolation, right? So for an example, let's say you're writing an Express backend API and you have a route that calls a callback function. You can test that function in isolation, right? So you can write a jest test or write a mocha test or whatever. And you want to verify that when you pass certain things into that function, that when the function runs, it's going to do some side effects, which would mean like store some data, fetch some data. And then eventually that function is going to return you some outputs, right? So test the inputs and the outputs of the function. And that's how you write a good unit test. Now, it's easier said than done because a lot of these functions have to interact with other third-party services. Maybe that's an API or a database. So you have to do a lot of like mocking to be able to correctly test these units of what we're calling. Now, a lot of people have different opinions on like what a unit is. My opinion on a unit is like a single function by itself. Now, if you're using like object-oriented programming, like a unit could be a class, a unit could be a module, but it's just something that you and your team need to decide, like how small is a unit and when did you cross the line from a unit test to an integration test, right? If you're testing like multiple things, multiple functions all interacting together, then that could be considered an integration test. But yeah, so that's kind of like I don't know if I'm explaining this well, but this is basically what I would test on the back end. Like do some unit tests over your domain, your business rules, your business logic. Typically you have like entities here as well. And you want to have a lot of like tests over your entities, your use cases, or whatever else that your business thing would have. Maybe you have like utility classes or utility functions. You want to test all those things. And those are like the main important things that you want to test. Now, when it comes to the front end, I mean, let's just assume that we're using like React or something. Just say front end. Again, so like you can structure your front end application to be tiered. You can have different tiers of your front end. And typically how this is split up, at least in the project I work on, is you have your view layer or your rendering engine, whatever you want to pick, right? So this is typically like Vue. This could be React. This could be Svelte. This could be Angular, right? So you have these like frameworks, and their main goal, they have one purpose, and that's to take your models, your data, your state, and render that out to the DOM and update the DOM, right? So if you really think about React, the main purpose of React is taking some like JavaScript variables and updating DOM. That's like the main purpose of React and all these other languages. And it turns out that they did provide like some ways to manage state, right? There's hooks that you can use to store state and, you know, set state. There's hooks you can use to manage the component life cycles. But for the most part, the Vue library, if you treat it as like a dumb rendering engine and that's it, then what you can actually do is you can create a bunch of front-end presentation logic, right? So I call this the presentation layer. Presentation layer. I don't know what other people might call this or if other people even do this. I guess if you do like an MVC approach with like model view controller, you call this your controller. This could be your view. And then you'd have like a model or something. I don't know. But this is like your presentation layer, which has like the logic behind the views. So for example, when you click on a button, what function does that call? And that function call would be defined here, right? You put the logic of like, what does a UI do when people click buttons? What does a UI do when a component mounts? Now, a lot of people just put that code directly inside their React components, and they test that with React testing library. I have a very different standpoint on that. I think that it's better to keep all your UI logic inside of a separate layer so that you can easily, again, write a bunch of unit tests over it. And this is up to you and your team, right? If you don't feel like there's value in unit testing, then just don't do unit testing. But I think there is value to it, and it really helps with the test-driven development approach. And then there's like another layer here too, which is like your third-party libraries and dependencies. So like Axios, I could just say like third-party steps. And there's definitely not enough real estate for me to type all this stuff. But this is like Axios, you know, whatever type of proxies you might be calling. This could be some type of like state management as well. Like let's say you wanted to do Zustan. But the idea, again, it kind of similar to the backend approach where you keep all of these third-party libraries kind of out of your core business logic. You can do the same approach with your presentation layer. Like try to keep all of these third-party dependencies that are kind of like really specific to React. Keep those out of your presentation layer and try to keep this, you know, try to make this have all your logic. And it's kind of easier said than done. Like just getting this right is kind of hard. And that's why people probably don't do it, because it just takes a lot of extra work and a lot of mental overhead to like split this stuff up and not put a bunch of logic all in your React components. But as your React components get more dynamic and a lot more complex, it just makes sense to like keep all the logic out of it. But anyway, I'm just kind of ranting at this point. But again, like unit testing, this is like the first line of defense when you're building out applications. You have these functions and modules. You want to write code that tests these functions and modules in isolation. And it really helps when you do unit testing to do it with test-driven development, where you might have to build a page that has a couple of buttons and it needs to show some state and you need to filter and do some different things, right? So you can actually write a bunch of tests first that says like when a user clicks on a search button, I should probably get some random data from the backend. I can mock that out, and I want to verify that the state is set properly with whatever this data that was returned from my Axios call or whatever third-party API thing that you're using. And once that state is set, like you need to have computeds that might change what's actually displayed in the UI. So you might have like, your actual 100 records that was returned from the backend, you put that in the state, but then you might have computed methods that only return a subset of that data. So again, like you have this additional complexity that keeps on getting added to your views, and you have to, in my opinion, test that stuff, right? I personally like to shoot for like 95% code coverage on everything that's worth testing. Again, don't test your third-party libraries. Like you don't need to test Axios or Zustan. Go open those on GitHub and look to see how much code coverage they have. If they're like 95% covered, then there's no reason to test these third-party dependencies. If they don't have any coverage at all, then you might want to try to like make sure that they're somewhat tested. And you can test those with integration tests, honestly. But again, like we don't want to test React in Svelte and Angular because again, those are huge frameworks that have been tested and used and, battle proven for a very long time. So again, like don't test these things. Just test your presentation layer and test your domain entities. You could also test your persistence if you want to, if it gets more complicated. But those are the things that I would personally unit test. Now, with all that being said, like I really haven't talked about integration testing. So if you imagine, integration testing is taking some of these things and testing them together, right? So if you wanted to, for some reason, if you really wanted to test your views, like you wanted to actually simulate a user clicking on a button in your DOM, and you wanted to make sure that when they click the button on the DOM, I then see 5 or 10 DOM elements show up in a list on my DOM, then you could do some type of integration testing using like JS DOM or React testing library or whatever you want to do. But basically, integration testing is you take a box and you kind of test certain things together to make sure it works pretty well. So in this case, like you could do something like React testing library to basically test your presentation logic with your actual like rendering engine together to make sure that you do have it all kind of hooked up together. Now, if you're using TypeScript, I will say that a majority of the bugs happen inside this presentation layer, especially if complexity starts growing and you have a lot of edge cases and a lot of ways that you can filter and show and hide different things. The complexity lives here. Typically, it's not because of like in a JSX component or a TSX component, you forgot to call the correct method. Because if you're using TypeScript, it's going to yell at you if you're trying to call the wrong presenter method or you're trying to bind to the wrong presenter state, right? So testing these things together, I don't really find that much of a benefit, but I could see how it could be beneficial. So when I do integration testing, at least in our project, what we actually do, which is kind of probably not orthodox, which probably goes against like what a lot of people do, is, I forgot to mention, so like when you're using React testing libraries, typically they have like something called like mock service worker, which might live like here, mock service worker. I think that's what it's called. But they're basically mocking out the layer between the front end and the back end, or the communication between the front end and the back end, right? So if I go ahead and draw a line here, typically there's like a two-way communication between your front end and your back end, right? It could be REST, GraphQL, gRPC, tRPC, it doesn't matter. But I think what mock service worker does is it basically creates like a mock between this, so your front end can kind of be tested in isolation, which is good. I'm not saying that this is a bad approach, and in fact, you should probably do some type of integration testing with this. But the way that we actually do integration testing on our project is we decided that we are not going to bother testing the views. Just don't worry about the views. We trust that a developer can correctly connect an on-click method to the correct on-click listener inside the presentation layer, right? TypeScript will give you that feedback. It'll give you those warnings if you're binding to the wrong stuff. So we say that, we're just not going to test this layer because using tests that use JS DOM are pretty slow, right? Anytime you have to load up a browser or simulate a DOM and simulate React and Vue and Angular running, you're eating up a ton of development time and resources because this stuff is kind of slow to keep on running over and over and over again in a test CI/CD pipeline or locally on your machine. So in our project, we are actually testing at this layer when we do integration testing. So kind of like that. And in a sense, like this is kind of like an end-to-end test, but technically to be an end-to-end test, let me go ahead and delete this. So let me just show you here. this is how we do integration testing on our current project. Again, is this the best approach? I don't know, but it's helped us ship things to production with very little bugs. So I think the approach works pretty fine. I'm not going to say it's good or bad, but it's just different. Where we basically spin up the UI, we spin up the backend, we have a mock database set up, and we are testing from the presentation layer. So like we actually in test, we invoke controllers, and those controllers will hit the backend API endpoints. They'll persist data to a mock database, and they will read data from a mock database. So we kind of do like actual like user flows and user journeys starting at this layer all the way through a system and then all the way back. And then again, of course, you could always just draw a line here if you wanted to, but at that point, like, I'm not sure what the true benefit is, because you could just like, I guess you're just testing out the layer at that point, right? Which is you can cover in unit tests. So the real benefit is you're doing an integration testing from this, so your presentation logic and layer, all the way to basically your business domain entities and use cases and business logic. Now, I will say that you could probably extend this here because we do test our persistence methods. I guess I probably should have done that to begin with, because technically there's like a database over here on the right. So if I just get like a database, we have like a mock, the persistence layer is going to communicate with a mock database, right? But we mock it out. So we just have like a fake locally running database that is able to handle all this traffic. So that's integration testing, where you take different parts of your system and you see how they work together, right? And if you have a larger system, like you might have other services here, you might have like microservices, and you might decide that we just want to integrate these things together, like those two boxes together, and you can do an integration test with that, right? So it's up to you and your team to decide, like, at what levels do we want to actually start integrating stuff together, testing it together, and make sure it works. My project is not, we're not doing microservices. It's more of like a monolithic approach. So we don't have to test like different things and like mix and match how stuff is integrated together. We just host the entire UI and backend together, and we just start firing presentation logic and make sure that the things that come back and state changes the way that we expect it to change. And then there's end-to-end. So end-to-end is when you bring in, let me zoom out a little bit. Technically, I think you probably need to have like a real running database to do end-to-end. I could be wrong about that, but like that's typically you actually deploy to a real environment. Everything is set up. You have like a real database. And when you do an end-to-end test, the main difference is that this testing box is actually going to go over and include your front-end frameworks as well. And then like you're going to have the browser here. So like, I'll just say browser. So Chrome, Edge, whatever else, Firefox. You'd have your browsers here, and you basically have tests that check that when the browser loads your page, is it rendering the correct things? And when they click buttons, does that do the right things? And does that actually create data in the backend? And does that get saved to the real database? And you might have a bunch of other stuff going on behind the scenes too. Like in our example, we have like S3 buckets that store files. And then we have a bunch of other stuff that's doing stuff. Like if I could find, they're like SQS, SNS. Yeah, so SQS, SES. So in our system, like technically this thing would be dragged over too, right? Your entire test is covering like a fully deployed system with everything running. That's considered like end-to-end, in my opinion. So I'll change this to like end-to-end testing. And the benefit of that is like sometimes when you deploy systems to your cloud providers, like you've misconfigured how something is set up with emails. So like when you start trying to send emails from your UI, at some point it's going to try to send out an email using Amazon SES, and then it just doesn't work. Or for some reason, like you're trying to upload images and files to a bucket and it's just not working. So you'll encounter those issues, and you will find those issues in end-to-end tests. And that's kind of why we do end-to-end testing. But at the same time, you can imagine how slow these tests are and how brittle they are. Because if any point in time, if one of these things break, then your entire test breaks and you don't know what really failed, right? So you have to go back and rerun it. Maybe it was a fluke. Maybe it was a timing issue. Maybe it was a race condition. You don't know. But sometimes the issue with end-to-end testing is that they're super slow to write, they're super slow to run, and they're very costly to maintain. So just keep that in mind. Those are the three main types of testing. There's unit testing, super easy to manage and maintain and write because it's just you literally have a function, you write a test over that function. Integration testing, again, you have like a smaller subset of things combined together, actually talking to each other using, HTTP calls or TCP calls, whatever. And you're testing those layers together. Those tests are more expensive to write. They run slower because you're actually sending like data across the wire. Sometimes it's all running locally on your laptop, but still like there's legit network requests being made on your network card of your laptop. So they're slower, and you don't want to write as many, in my opinion. Unit tests are like the things you need to have the most of. And then you want to have a decent amount of integration tests, and then finally end-to-end tests. Try to not write that many, just write as many as you can to like make sure that these services are correctly integrated with, so that when you do a full deploy and you decide to like switch users over to your new deployment, you have confidence that like this stuff is all configured correctly and you're able to send out emails or whatever. So there's this idea like a testing pyramid, which I think everyone kind of knows this, the testing pyramid, where you have a ton of unit tests down at the bottom. You have a lot of integration tests, and then you try to have as little end-to-end tests as possible. And then even here, they put manual tests, right? So even before you go to production or deploy, like sometimes you'll have teams that have people like a QA engineer or a team of QA engineers who go and verify, is this deployment going to work? They'll go through, they'll click buttons, they'll make sure everything seems fine. And those can also be costly because like you actually have to pay someone to go through the UI and click them, unless you're outsourcing your resources to like do it for cheap. But it does cost money to actually have someone, spend 8 hours a day testing stuff, clicking things, and making sure everything works. And it also kind of slows down your entire pipeline because now you have to wait for someone to check off your feature before you can go to prod with that feature. But yeah, I don't know. I didn't really prepare for this video, so I'm kind of all over the place. But I hope this was kind of an okay understanding of like how we, at my project, we do different types of testing, how you can kind of split up your layers from your backend and your front end and test different parts together. And then how finally at the very end, after you've integrated everything in a real system, how you can do end-to-end testing with a real browser hitting like real Amazon resources, etc. But yeah, join my Discord if you want to talk to me directly or ask anyone or ask questions in my community. We have a lot of people trying to learn how to code, and it's a good community just to try to reach out and get help if you're stuck. Yeah, have a good day and happy coding.